and recall it. Thomas Fox married Rose Heslin, and they had 7 children. Tom, Jim, Bill, Kate Poole, Mary Fitzgerald, Elizabeth Bean, and Nellie McMahon. They were all born in Brooklyn, New York. But Tom Fox, the senior, was injured when he worked on the New York Police Department. I believe he was thrown from a paddy wagon and got some kind of a busted up elbow. They then moved to New Boston, Massachusetts, where my grandfather had a farm. He had raised cattle, and he had a sawmill. The children joined them in New Boston, and they Kate went to normal school and became a teacher, and she taught in the New Boston school system, a one-room school, until she was over 60 years old. My father, Tom, moved back to New York, and he enlisted in the Army in the Rainbow Division in about 1916 or 17, and was a member of the Father Duffy Brigade. Bill and Jim both went to work for the post office, and that they also served in the military in World War I. Elizabeth and Nellie were both telephone operators in the Winston Telephone Company. Mary Fitzgerald moved to Bridgeport with her husband, Joe Fitzgerald, who was also in the Army and was severely wounded in World War I. At the end of World War I, Tom Fox married Helen Fisher, Fischer, and they had 3 children, me, Tom, Helen, and Janet. He worked as a ship fitter in the Bliss shipyards in Brooklyn, New York at that time. They lived on 55th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue in Brooklyn. And they lived with Helen's mother, Mrs. Fisher. When she died, she left the house to Helen and Tom, and they sold the property to the Sperry Company and moved to Flatbush in Brooklyn. At that time, Tom shifted jobs from ship fitter to working for the Department of Docks in New York, and Helen was a housewife. The 3 children, myself and the 2 girls, were all born in Brooklyn, and we lived there on 55th Street. And I went to St. Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church, and where I first started school. Jeanette and Helen did not start school at that church. We then sold the house, and we moved to Flatbush, where we went to school at PS 49 on Avenue D in Flatbush. We lived at East 49th Street between Farragut Road and Foster Road. In 1932, our mother died, and she was buried from St. Teresa the Little Flower Church on Avenue D in New York, and is buried in that church's cemetery. My father was unable to take care of 3 children by himself, so our Aunt Elizabeth and Aunt Nellie took us, and brought us up to Winston, where we lived with them in Winston. Our first place of living was a 4-room apartment in what was called the Nader block. Nader was the father of Ralph Nader, the writer and politician. We all went to St. Anthony's School in Winston, and we all three of us graduated from St. Anthony's. When we started and went to Gilbert School, where I stayed and Jeanette stayed. Helen moved back to New York, where she lived with our father and her stepmother, May, at 95-71st Street, near Shore Road in Brooklyn, the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn. Helen went on to Fordham Nursing School, where she graduated about 1942 and became a nurse then. And she married Bill Donnelly. They lived at City Island in New York for a little while, but they ended up getting a divorce pretty soon after. Your mother probably knows more about that than I do. Then Helen moved to Fordham Road in the Bronx, while she worked at a hospital on Fordham Road, where she was mugged at one time and got disappointed with New York, and so she moved to Boynton Beach, Florida with her friend Mrs. Brady, where she lived till she died, where your mother and father used to take good care of her and visit her and looked after her. Your father used to do all her house repair works for her when they'd be down there on vacation. Helen lived, after Mrs. Brady died, she lived by herself until she got very sick, and she ended up in a rest home where she lived for the last few months of her life until she died. In 1941, I enlisted in the Navy right after Pearl Harbor, and I was stationed in New London, Connecticut, and Fisher's Island, New York. Your mother visited me at Fisher's Island one time. I have pictures of it at the time she was down there. Then 1943, early 43, I believe it was, Jeanette enlisted in the Navy and was sent to NOB Norfolk, where she stayed for a while and met your father. In the 1943, 1944, and 45, I was on a ship called the USS Tom Bigby, and we served in the Pacific Ocean. It was there that I met your father for the first time. We were at a place called Ulysses, which is a Navy anchorage. And one time, a fleet oiler named the Saugatuck came into and anchored right next to us. And the signal came over to the ship, is there Tom Fox on that ship? And I answered, yes, I'm Tom Fox. And he said to me on the light, I'm Kurt Merriman, and I'm going to marry your sister, which he did. And we spent an afternoon together, and then he was sent back to the United States on the Saugatuck. And that's where your mother and he were married. Our ship went on to invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and then we went to Sasebo, Japan. From there, on November 4th, 1945, I had enough points to get out of the Navy, and I came home. I married Rita Yorker on August 5th, 1946. We were on our way out to Columbus, Ohio on our honeymoon at the same time that Bunny was born. We got on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and I blew 3 tires on my Uncle Gene's car, and I ran out of money, so we had to turn around and go home. By the time we got home, I only had 50 cents left in my pocket. We had our 5 children were born over the next 10 years, and they have all grown up. My father owned a home at 95-71st Street in Brooklyn, the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, right off Shore Road. That's where he lived until he died, and he is buried in the National Cemetery about 3 hours out on Long Island. His wife, May, went back to Ireland. I haven't heard from her since. I think your mother did once.